Thank you, Ambassador Andesha. You have stirred a lot of questions. We have now 8 questions regarding your speech, so we'll take them afterwards. Um, so just quickly to move on, and then at the end we can of course discuss the speech. I listened very carefully, and for me it was a lecture in diplomacy regarding South Asia, India, and Pakistan. I found it a very interesting speech. We'll move on to Dr. O'Hanlon, who is at the Brookings Institution, and he is also going to talk where you ended actually, which is state-sponsored terrorism in the region, whether we can see a change or not.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. It's nice to be with you today. And even though I speak just for myself, I do want to convey the very best wishes of my colleagues at Brookings who have a great interest in South Asia, including, of course, retired General John Allen, as well as Bruce Rydell and Vonda Feldbad-Brown, and my recent co-author, Medea Afzal. So building on the ambassador's excellent observation that we are a little bit gender challenged this day in our panel, I will nonetheless speak partly based on an article that I recently wrote with Professor Medea Afzal, who's Pakistani American and very thoughtful on these issues. And I really just want to make 3 main points. First, I don't think the United States will withdraw. But second, if we did, I believe the situation would be terrible. And then third, I do not believe the Biden administration is going to get close to Pakistan. I think we are beyond the days where any American administration will believe very enthusiastically that a US-Pakistan relationship can be at the center of our foreign policy in South Asia. Obviously, we would welcome an improved relationship with Pakistan, and we're hopeful that Pakistan will play a more constructive role in the peace process, as Pakistan has said. And I would say there have been at least small encouraging steps. But Americans of both political parties are too aware of the difficulty in working with Pakistan. In fact, there's a famous expression that I think Teresita Schaefer, Ambassador Schaefer, and others have sometimes applied to the US-Pakistan relationship, which is, it's like a marriage, except we've already been married 3 times and divorced 3 times, if you go back to the history of US-Pakistan relations. So beginning with that point and imagining the trajectory through the years, I would submit that even though we will try to collaborate with Pakistan, we will not have any illusions. And the more natural partnership for the United States in South Asia is with India, despite the setbacks with Prime Minister Modi and the concerns about his human rights record. Let me add one more point on Pakistan, and then I'll come back to my other 2 main points about my prediction that the United States will not withdraw and my concerns if it did withdraw. But on Pakistan, even though I do not expect a particular rapprochement, I do not expect a close relationship during the Biden years with the Khan government or any other potential government in Islamabad, I would still say that we Americans need to remember what we asked historically of both Afghanistan and Pakistan, because the challenges of the region today are very much an outgrowth of what happened at the end of the Cold War, and specifically the response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then the decision by the United States and Pakistan, along with some Middle Eastern, UAE and Saudi collaboration, to work to oppose the Soviet occupation. And for us, it was largely a question of trying to defeat Soviet expansionism globally. But Afghanistan became the focal point, and thanks to the efforts of Afghans and Pakistanis, and with resulting consequences for many Afghans and Pakistanis, the Soviets were defeated. That was a crucial step towards the end of the Cold War. So we have in the United States, I believe, an historic debt to Afghanistan and to Pakistan. And even if there are challenges, even if there are frustrations, we need to remember that debt. You probably don't need to hear that, but my fellow Americans may need to be reminded, because that history is becoming a bit old, and yet it still explains a lot of what's been going on even in modern times. Afghanistan, of course, has really had no period of peace since the late 1970s. And so we may in the United States be tired of the war in Afghanistan, but Afghans and Pakistanis have a real right to be tired of that war because it has not gone away for the adult lifetime of anybody on this panel. It's now more than 40 years old. My other 2 points, and I'll be relatively brief, and I do very much look forward to the discussion. And again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be part of this today. And I enjoyed as well Ambassador Andisha's comments and framing of the overall challenge. So let me say first what I think would happen if we were to pull out US and therefore other NATO troops. I do not believe that any NATO countries would keep military forces in Afghanistan if the United States were to depart. And therefore, I am conflating the United States with the NATO-led mission and overall international presence. By the way, I was on the Afghanistan study group that was run by retired General Joseph Dunford and retired Senator Kelly Ayotte, and the report was issued just in the last few weeks. I'm not speaking for that report or that study group either, but some of these findings emerged in the course of our work. And I believe that if the United States and NATO pulled out, there would not be a rapid resolution, either in terms of negotiation or in terms of fighting. You would have a war that would probably get even worse than it is right now. And the cities of Afghanistan would start to be much more vulnerable. Certainly, we know that Kunduz has already in recent years been assaulted by the Taliban, and it took some NATO help and American help to push back. There are other cities where the Taliban has been maintaining monitoring, vigilance, certainly cities in the east and south, but I think throughout much of the country. And we could expect that we would see battles in these places. But I do not believe the Taliban would win a quick, decisive victory, because even if we pull out our forces, I believe the international community would still fund the Afghan army and police. And for many people in those organizations, the idea of somehow changing sides would be unthinkable. It would be not only a repudiation of what they have been fighting for, but it would also put their own lives at risk, because of course the Taliban know who many of the people are who have been in the Afghan army and police. So just as we saw in Syria, where President Assad's forces, while they were very challenged and very threatened, they sort of hunkered down. A core part of that group increased its resolve to keep fighting when the Arab Spring and the initial revolts of 2011 and 12 played out. A lot of people predicted that Assad would fall and that his forces, made up primarily of Alawites, would simply collapse. Well, the forces weakened and a lot of people did leave, but a core group felt there was no choice but to stay with Assad because they were already implicated in everything about his regime. Now let's go back to Afghanistan. I am not suggesting any parallel between the Ghani government and the Assad government, but the same dynamic of preserving one's own survival is still relevant here. Anybody who's been associated for a long time with the Afghan army or police is not going to want to live in a Taliban-run country because they're going to be fearful for their own lives and those of their family. So we're going to see a civil war get worse. And it's not going to be likely to play out successfully for either side for some time. It may look like the Taliban has a chance for a quick victory, but I don't really think so, because the other thing that will happen, and this is what Medea Afzal and I wrote about last week in the Washington Post, what I believe will happen, even though it would be tragic, would be a form of ethnic cleansing. Because we all know, and again, my Afghan friends may want to comment later on this, but we all know that most Pashtun are not Taliban and do not support the Taliban. However, virtually all Taliban are Pashtun. The Taliban movement is essentially a Pashtun jihadist movement. It's a combination of, it has an ethnic element and it has a Salafist element. And it envisions a caliphate that is ultimately dominated by not only Sunni Muslims, but specifically Pashtun. That's been the origin, that's been the history. I see very little evidence that there is any big place in the Taliban movement for anybody except Pashtun. And therefore, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek, Turkmen, all of these groups are going to see the Taliban as a natural adversary. And they are going to be nervous that if they are around Pashtun, even though most Pashtun do not support the Taliban, even though most Pashtun are good people who believe in an open, free, and just Afghanistan for everyone, nonetheless, if you are a Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara, Turkmen, and you're in fear of your own life, you're in fear of Taliban infiltration or Taliban attack, the simplest way to protect yourself is to stay away from all Pashtun. And that becomes a recipe for ethnic cleansing, not one based on hatred, but based on survival. There is a literature about this in the American political science community. Barry Posen and others have written about this, the security dynamics that are involved when you have a group in a multi-ethnic society, a violent group associated with just one of those ethnicities. I'm not trying to criticize Afghans or Pashtun. I'm just saying that if you unleash this dynamic anywhere, and you have an extremist group affiliated with one ethnicity in a multi-ethnic society, there are powerful incentives for ethnic cleansing. So what I would expect to happen would be a civil war that does not simply continue as today, but then has an element of ethnic cleansing. And most Pashtun in the north, northeast, center of the country would be pushed out with some violence. I don't know if it would be genocidal violence, but there'd be some violence. But the main goal would be to get the Pashtun out. Kabul would then become a disputed city. And I don't know what would happen to Kabul, except I'm sure it would be a shell of its former self because it's not really easily defensible. I believe the Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara homeland would naturally go to the highlands and the northeast and the east and the center of the country. The Salam Tunnel would become, in a sense, a dividing line. It'd probably be destroyed and essentially sealed off. And the north would then become a geographically separate region. And ultimately, I would envision some kind of partitioning of the country where the Taliban are powerful in part of the south and east. Other Pashtun militias that don't accept the Taliban would also have their own territorial holdings. The south and the east of the country would look like Afghanistan did in the 1990s, although the Taliban would probably be the strongest group. They would not necessarily dominate. And then there would be, over time, the emergence of a proto-state in the north and east that would be primarily Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek, Turkmen. So you asked on today's panel discussion about the future of terrorism and extremism in South Asia after a US withdrawal. That is my best guess as to what it would look like. And from an American point of view, this is not very appealing for at least two reasons. One reason, of course, is the humanitarian tragedy. Many of our Afghan friends that we've been working with for 20 years now would be the victims of this kind of violence in one way or another, as would women's rights, minority rights throughout the entire South and East. And a second concern would be more strategic, which would be that in this entire Southeast region, the United States would not have reliable allies or access for intelligence or military operations. And we would be trying to deal with extremism, including the Haqqani network, other Al-Qaeda affiliates, any other Salafist groups that had global ambitions. We would be trying to watch them and, if necessary, attack them from some distance away in the Indian Ocean, or perhaps a base up in this proto-state in the north that I've speculated might come into being. But it's very hard to do effective counterterrorism from that kind of distance. And so I think we would have to worry that, in fact, there would be now the world's largest caliphate that would form in southeastern Afghanistan under Taliban rule for a large chunk of that space. And I think that's a substantial security threat for the United States. We could still try to monitor what happened there and address any large concentrations of extremist fighters. But as we saw in Syria and Iraq with the prevalence of ISIS and the caliphate of 2014, 2015, 2016, if you concede that much territory to an extremist organization, some very bad things can happen inside of that territory that you have a very hard time watching or controlling from a distance. So that leads me to my final point, and I'll be brief. Because of the scenario that I just laid out, I do not think President Biden will withdraw from Afghanistan. I simply don't believe it. Now, he himself may not have decided. He himself may be trying to hold out some leverage and pressure on President Ghani and others to do real serious negotiation and be willing to accept power, even to stand down from power. And perhaps if Ghani misplayed his hand badly enough, perhaps at some point Biden could leave. But May 1st is way too soon. Just logistically, it's not realistic anymore. It's only 6 weeks away. We would have to destroy lots of American equipment in place. It would look almost like the departure from Vietnam in the mid-1970s. This would be, an abomination in terms of American reputation and resolve. And politically, Joe Biden's not going to want to do that because he can try to blame the failure on Donald Trump or George Bush if he wants to. But he will have been the president who pulled out and conceded Afghanistan to the ravages of civil war and possible Taliban rule. That's not something that an American president wants to do, because right now the Afghanistan issue is not that important in our debate. We're not talking about it that much back in the United States. It's not like it was 10 and 15 years ago where this was one of the most prominent topics. And therefore, if Biden tries to solve a very small problem, the so-called forever war in Afghanistan, by pulling out, he's going to create a much bigger problem for himself, which will be the repudiation of America's commitment to women's rights, minority rights, constitutional and democratic rule, and safety for our own people based on what's happening inside of Afghanistan today. He will be giving up, in a sense, a huge territory, accepting a strategic defeat, conceding a major victory to terrorist or extremist organizations. And just for the purpose of getting 3,000 US troops out of Afghanistan, it doesn't make any sense. 3,000 US troops in Afghanistan is not a particularly demanding burden on our military or our foreign policy. And it's not a particularly demanding burden on Joe Biden's politics. He doesn't have to do anything differently in Afghanistan. There's no big marches in Washington about Afghanistan. We have lots of marches about other things, but we don't have any marches about Afghanistan, which means that for Biden, the greater risk by far is not staying, but rather is leaving. So my prediction is he will try to gain some leverage with the Ghani government, and he should. I've had the pleasure of knowing President Ghani for 15 or 20 years. I think he's a very bright man and a very dedicated patriot, but I also think he may need to consider some pretty bold steps that he perhaps has not yet been willing to contemplate, including possibly stepping down as part of a power-sharing government, if the terms of that government can be ever developed in such a way as to be fair to the people of Afghanistan. So I do think it's reasonable for President Biden to try to get some leverage on President Ghani. But the real problem is the Taliban. And let's not lose sight of that. And I don't think in the end, President Biden will lose sight of that. Thank you, and over to you.